Human rights experts are calling for an international investigation into the disappearance of a prominent Saudi journalist. They're worried the longtime Washington Post contributor may have been abducted or even killed for speaking out against Saudi Arabia's government. Correspondent Wyatt Goolsby has reaction from the State Department. Good evening, Wyatt.
Good evening, Lauren. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says the U.S. is concerned about the disappearance of Jamal Khashoggi, a Saudi native and a U.S. resident. Pompeo says officials here are in contact with their counterparts in Saudi Arabia. They're calling on the Saudi government to release as much information as possible.
This security footage from 1 week ago marks the last time anyone has seen Washington Post contributor Jamal Khashoggi. His fiancée says the 59-year-old entered the Saudi consulate in Istanbul to pick up paperwork for his marriage. She says he never came out. President Erdogan of Turkey is pointing the finger at the Saudi government. He says Khashoggi was murdered inside the consulate. Saudi Arabia denies the claim. The kingdom says he left the consulate, but officials have yet to provide video evidence. Saudi Arabia says it will allow Turkish officials to inspect the building. President Trump has weighed in.
I am concerned about it. I don't like hearing about it. And hopefully that will sort itself out.
Protesters gathered outside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul are demanding answers. Human rights advocates say both Saudi Arabia and Turkey have a responsibility to clarify what happened. Officials at the United Nations agree.
This is of serious concern, this apparent enforced disappearance of Mr. Khashoggi from the consulate of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in Istanbul is of serious concern.
Investigators in Turkey say Khashoggi had written columns critical of the Saudi crown prince. The United States is an ally of Saudi Arabia, but the government has a poor record on human rights and religious liberty. Dwight Bashir, with the bipartisan U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, just returned from a trip to Saudi Arabia. He notes Catholics and other non-Muslims are not allowed to openly worship, for example.
Part of I think what needs to happen here is it needs to be something that is less of a top-down implemented process and more listening to the people and reacting. Because if it's top-down, inevitably those could be temporary moves and won't be sustainable and lasting.
Dwight Bashir notes that many of the religious liberty issues in Saudi Arabia are linked to human rights concern, like restrictions on women driving, for example. He says it's important the U.S. promote freedom in all its aspects: speech, worship, and freedom of the press. Lauren?
Correspondent Wyatt Goolsby reporting from the State Department. Thank you, Wyatt.